How did a car become something that every American household could afford? A time when the world witnessed a revolution in manufacturing. The birth of the first moving assembly line for the production of Ford's Model T.
Ford didn't save itself by building a new car. It saved itself by shutting every one of its factories down. For 19 years, Ford had built exactly one product, and that single product had made it the most successful automobile company on Earth. Then, at the height of that success, Ford did something almost no thriving company ever willingly does. It stopped. Assembly lines that had run for nearly 2 decades went completely silent. Tens of thousands of workers were sent home. And for months, Ford earned almost nothing from new car sales. It sounds like corporate suicide. It's the kind of move that would get most modern CEOs fired before lunch, not celebrated in a textbook decades later. This video takes you inside Ford's real 1927 shutdown and rebuild. The factories gutted down to the studs, the machines scrapped by the thousands, and the gamble that either would have restored the company or handed the entire market to its rivals. Right now, let's step inside. For nearly 2 decades, the Ford Model T had done what no automobile before it ever had. Introduced in 1908, it turned the motor car from a luxury item into something ordinary families could actually afford. More than 15 million examples rolled off Ford's assembly lines during its 19-year production run, making it the most successful automobile the world had ever seen. It hadn't just sold well, it had reshaped transportation itself. Ford had built its entire reputation on one core promise: an affordable, reliable car for the average family, produced faster and cheaper than anyone thought possible. For nearly 2 decades, that single idea was enough to dominate an entire industry, with little need to change the product itself. But by the mid-1920s, something had shifted. Chevrolet and General Motors were no longer competing with Ford on price alone. They offered fresh styling every year, brighter colors, smoother rides, and features buyers had started to expect. Ford, meanwhile, kept refining an aging design, still betting that reliability mattered more than appearance. Customers were beginning to disagree, and that disagreement was about to force Ford's hand. Most companies in Ford's position would have replaced the Model T gradually, keep the factories running, introduce the new model in stages, lose as little money as possible along the way. Henry Ford had something else in mind entirely. On May 26, 1927, Ford and his son Edsel watched the 15 millionth and final Model T leave the Highland Park assembly line. It marked the end of an era that had lasted almost 19 years and reshaped an entire industry. Rather than update the Model T while production continued, Ford chose to stop everything and begin again with a completely new automobile, one that would eventually revive a name from the company's very first production car back in 1903, the Model A. Picture standing outside a Ford factory in the summer of 1927. The assembly lines that once produced thousands of cars a day had gone completely silent. Freight trains still arrived. The buildings still stood. But nothing rolled out the gates. For nearly 6 months, Ford earned almost nothing from new car sales, while risking its entire position in one of the world's fastest-growing industries. The scale of the shutdown is still hard to fully comprehend. Tens of thousands of workers were temporarily laid off during the shutdown. Inside the factories, a large majority of Ford's existing machine tools had to be replaced, rebuilt, or heavily modified, since they'd been built specifically for the Model T. By the time the transformation was complete, Ford had invested close to $250 million, an extraordinary sum for 1927. It was a gamble that could have revived the company or handed the entire market to its rivals. For Ford in 1927, there was no guarantee the gamble would succeed. The company had stopped production, invested heavily, and placed its entire future on an automobile the public hadn't even seen yet. Here's what nobody outside the factory walls could fully see. Those silent buildings weren't empty. They'd become enormous construction sites. One by one, the machines that had built the Model T for nearly 2 decades were pulled out and replaced with new precision tooling. Production lines that had been optimized around the Model T were dismantled and redesigned from scratch, station by station, in a matter of months. Meanwhile, thousands of workers who had spent years mastering one set of tools now had to learn an entirely different set of parts and procedures, which meant some of Ford's most experienced employees were, in a strange way, suddenly the newest people on the factory floor. At the same time, Ford's vast River Rouge complex was being prepared for large-scale Model A production, bringing raw materials, manufacturing, and final assembly together under one roof. When the factories came back to life, they weren't just building a different car. They'd become a different manufacturing system entirely. The Model A wasn't an improved Model T. It was a genuinely different automobile, with virtually no parts carried over from its predecessor. A decision that forced Ford to redesign almost everything from the ground up. The body sat lower and looked sleeker, shaped heavily by Edsel Ford's eye for styling. Under the hood was a new 200.5 cubic inch four-cylinder engine, producing around 40 horsepower, enough to push the car to speeds between 55 and 65 miles per hour, far beyond what most Model T owners had ever experienced. It also introduced features rarely seen in an affordable car at the time, including triplex shatterproof safety glass and hydraulic shock absorbers, both firsts for Ford. The Model A era helped establish the blue oval badge as one of Ford's most recognizable symbols. As Henry Ford put it, the plan was to wipe the slate clean and start all over again. After months of secrecy, the wait ended in December 1927, when Ford unveiled the Model A to the public, and the response was unlike anything the industry had seen before. Millions of people visited Ford dealerships during the first week alone. In several cities, crowds grew so large that police were called in simply to manage traffic around packed showrooms. But success brought its own problem. Demand exploded almost overnight. While the newly retooled factories were still finding their rhythm, Ford had built the car everyone wanted and still couldn't build it fast enough. For a company that had just spent 6 months producing nothing, going from silence to a full-blown shortage in a matter of weeks was its own strange kind of problem to have. This is where the gamble finally met reality. The Model A became one of the first major Ford models produced at the massive River Rouge complex, where materials, components, and finished assembly came together in one massive production system. Chassis frames moved through newly redesigned assembly lines, pausing just long enough for workers to install engines, transmissions, axles, body panels, and interiors before continuing on. Every vehicle then passed through painting, inspection, and mechanical testing before it was allowed to leave the building. None of this ran smoothly on day one. Workers who had spent years perfecting Model T procedures were essentially starting their careers over, learning an unfamiliar car on an unfamiliar line. Early production stayed slow while workers adjusted to unfamiliar tools and procedures, but improvements came steadily. By the middle of 1929, the Rouge plant had reached full capacity, producing roughly 9,000 Model A automobiles every single day. A remarkable recovery from a factory that had been completely silent less than 2 years earlier. The risk paid off. By the end of production in 1931, Ford had built roughly 5 million Model A vehicles worldwide, proving the company could do something few industrial giants ever manage: reinvent itself while it was still on top, rather than waiting until decline forced its hand. The Model A restored Ford's ability to compete in a market now driven by style and comfort, not price alone, while keeping the reliability the brand had always been known for. It became the bridge between the revolutionary Model T and the powerful V8 models that would define Ford's next chapter. Looking back, the real achievement wasn't building another successful car. Ford had already mastered mass production years earlier. The harder, far riskier decision was choosing to stop that machine, tear much of it apart, and accept months of building nothing at all. Closing. Inventing the moving assembly line changed manufacturing forever. Having the courage to shut it down and start over may have been Henry Ford's boldest decision of all. It is the kind of gamble that looks brilliant in a history book, and looked like career suicide to anyone standing in that empty parking lot at the time. A factory that had built the same automobile for 19 years had stopped completely, rebuilt itself from the ground up, and returned with something entirely new. The greatest lesson of the Model A was never really about how Ford built a car. It was about knowing when to stop building the old one.